Welcome to Flashback, a podcast by the Okaloosa County Public Information Office. Get ready to dust the nostalgia off your sleeve as we talk with Okaloosa citizens who share with us how things used to be. I'm your host, Nick Tomachek. It's time to step into your imaginary DeLorean, tap your flux capacitor, and flash back.
Hello, Flashbackers. What do you think of when you think of the town of Shalimar? If you don't live there, you may think of a bridge, a 6-lane thoroughfare with some gas stations, the tax collector office, and some decent lunch spots. If you live there or have spent any time within the town limits, and the town isn't quite as big as the post office makes it out to be, I'll get to that later. If you live there, in the town limits, you know the town is impeccably well maintained from a visual standpoint. Yards are groomed, the balance between shade trees and open air is comforting, and the town hall and its chief of police, John Cash, yes, that's his name, still has a small town feel inside. It almost boasts its simplicity to the rest of the world around it, a world that in the summertime here seems to be covered in the angst of tourists and the rush of people hurrying to have fun. Well, the town of Shalimar recently celebrated its 75th anniversary, and I thought it would be timely to explore some of the history of Shalimar. Some of you local history buffs probably already know some things, but some of these that I'm about to talk about you may not. We'll get into whether German U-boats actually infiltrated the shores of the Choctaw Bay, and what would have happened if it turned into the largest seaport in the world as some early developers wanted. And of course, we'll discuss the role of the nightlife in the early years of Shalimar. One of the most remarkable things I discovered about Shalimar is about a place called Black Point. It's located on the Choctawhatchee Bay where Meigs Drive, Jack Nicklaus Way, and Boulevard of Champions comes together. I learned about this area from a link that the current Shalimar mayor, Mark Franks, he shared with me, and it goes to a Facebook post, a historic Facebook group called West Florida and Panhandle History Expressed. In the post, there was a photo of an old man standing next to an old metal mining cart. It's the kind that you might see in an old-timey documentary about miner 49ers. It was full of some kind of black rock-like substance that had the look of coal, and it appeared to be sitting on tracks of some kind. On the other side of this man was an ox or a cow or some kind of livestock used for working. The post said it was a man at the phosphorus mine in Shalimar about 1913 or so. A phosphorus mine in Shalimar? This piqued my interest. Farther down in the post, a woman by the name of Kay Saxon Brooks posted excerpts from old articles that described the area where the photo was taken. According to the articles Kay had found, it wasn't a phosphorus mine. It was, though, a mine for a substance called humate, and it was used for making dye. I reached out to Kay Saxon Brooks to see if her curiosity into this part of Shalimar was as intense as mine. Mine, get it? All right, here's Kay.
Well, I live about 9 houses down from Black Point.
Wow.
And I'm a local, so when I was raised right down at 48 Meigs Drive. So we would play down there all the time as children. There was no development down there.
Wow.
At the end of Meigs Drive, where there's a stop sign where you can go either right or left on Boulevard of Champions, there weren't any houses out here, and that was completely undeveloped. People still hunted back there and went down to Lake Lorraine to fish. There were alligators in the lake.
Huh.
But anyway, the dye plant, Mama had a friend by the name of Doris Hanks. Her husband had a gas station up in Shalimar. His name was David Hanks. Then they would always take us in the Jeep on the weekends all around the county, going in the woods looking for different stuff. And we would sometimes go down to Black Point to where the dye plant was and look for old artifacts like glass bottles and things like that. And then as we would grow up, when you were outside all the time, so we would always either range towards Black Point or down towards what we call the Channel, what is now called Meigs Park. And we would just go on all day long and play down there all the time. So then as I got older and understood the history of the dye plant, I collected some of those newspaper articles when I was looking for some of the history of our area. And because it's so close and so pertinent, I really took an interest in it. Then I happened to come across the article that Dr. John Bryant, the geologist professor up at Northwest Florida, wrote about the humate that was mined at the dye plant.
Yeah.
So that I came across that at a fortuitous time, and so I reached out to him to talk to him about that. So we've been kind of emailing back and forth with some of asking questions about the history, and he was filling me in on some of the stuff. There was nothing left by the time we came along, which was in the 60s when we were ranging as children playing. There was nothing left except, for the surface articles like the glass bottles and things like that. But at one time, according to that newspaper article and some of the other things, it was thriving. When my daddy went to war in the 40s, there were 70 people in Fort Walton. Back at the turn of the century, 1910 and 17, there were 250 people employed at Black Point.
Wow.
Because of that dye plant. But you could hear people, it was probably illegal, but you could hear people through the years when I was growing up shooting down there.
Gotcha.
And it was so grown up, even when I was little, and they used to, I don't know where it was, but sometimes prisoners would get loose, and the sheriff's posse was literally on horses back then, and you could hear them coming down the street looking for the prisoners got loose.
Very, very interesting. Very cool.
Yeah, it was so wooded back here then.
And so I guess that was pre-golf course and all that too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, where we live right now, my grandparents' house, they had it was the first house built out here on Meggs Drive in this area when it developed. And it wasn't even Meggs Drive then. To get the materials here for the house was just a dim road that came off Eglin Parkway, which was only a two-lane road then. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there was nothing. I had bobcat and bear and deer and snakes, and it was wilderness, literally. It was pretty much the first residence literally built out here.
Wow. Because
my grandfather picked it. He's a big fisherman. He had a hardware store in Fort Walton called the Bay store.
Okay.
And he would trout fish over here, and his favorite spot was right off where we are now.
Right about the time the dye plant was in operation is about the same time as World War I. Kay's description of Black Point, as she remembers it, was interesting to hear. But what was humate really like? Kay shared with me a 1965 geological survey that describes the humate that existed in the 19-teens and still exists today. It describes Black Point with layers of dune and beach sand along the north coast of the Gulf of Mexico. It's cemented or impregnated with a conspicuous dark to brown, black water-soluble organic substance herein called humate. The humate cemented sand is generally 6 inches to 3 feet thick, but as much as 15 feet thick in some places. The survey goes on to say that it turns out that humate or humate cemented sand was used as a dye, as we already knew, of the Van Dyke brown color variety and used to dye paper and paints. A man by the name of Dr. J.D. Hassman from Vienna, Austria, claimed to have discovered this humate and embarked along with a businessman to create the dye plant that was described in an article as will be one of the most paying propositions in the state. Hassman would run this plant until 1916 when it was taken over by an operator by the name of Silas Gibson, who later became a well-known school builder and dairy farmer. Gibson was asked by a New Orleans firm to get the dye plant running and have the substance shipped west. The dye business was lucrative at the time because Germany had cut off supplies of the dye during World War I, and the U.S. needed another way to get dye. Now, speaking of Germany, you may have heard a wild story about German U-boats in the Choctaw Bay. I've found some newspaper stories about people making this claim, and one related to our Hassman that claimed he brought in workers to work at his plant that was disguised as a dye plant, but was really making gunpowder and other supplies for the Germans. And when the U.S. government found out he was doing this, Hassman split town and dumped all the evidence in Garnier's Bayou. I believe all this to be false, mainly because there is evidence that Hassman remained in the area well after World War I. Now, I do not know why Hassman stopped running the plant and why Gibson took it over. What I do know is that Gibson and Hassman had reportedly arrived in Camp Walton in the same week, and maybe Hassman just wasn't good at running a business, and after things went downhill, another company came in and hired Gibson to run it. Kay Saxon Brooks had some ideas about this too. Here's Kay again.
So I do not think a U-boat could have gotten in our pass at that time.
Yeah.
Now, were the German submarines off the coast here on the Gulf side? Absolutely.
Yeah? I haven't.
Well,
tell me more.
Well, my dad worked over at Tower Beach back in the 50s. They captured a German person for however he got on the shore. They found him and turned him over.
And this was in what time period was this that they found him?
During the war.
It was.
Yeah.
That's wild.
About the time I was researching this episode, I also heard from Gareth Stearns about this particular subject, and I had to get his input on this conspiracy mumbo jumbo.
I run a Facebook group called For Walton Beach What We Did. It's sort of become the definitive go-to resource for all things related to the history of Okaloosa County, or at least I like to think it is.
We know there was this substance out there at Black Point. Tell us what you found.
So there is an urban legend that Dr. Hossman may have been up to no good. Mm-hmm. He's got a German-sounding name.
Yeah.
This is World War I, or at the time they called it the Great War, or the war to end all wars. So naturally, people had suspicions about people with German-sounding names. So that's the first layer of where urban legends such as there were U-boats in the Choctaw Bay, or they weren't mining dye stuffs, they were making explosives or whatnot. But I came across an article from 1917 that lends some credence, perhaps, to at least how an urban legend like that could possibly come out.
Okay, what do we got here?
I'm going to read directly from this 1916 article entitled Industrial Preparedness. The Industrial Preparedness Inventory of the United States is the lion and mouse down to date. A number of our manufacturers at first doubted the ability of their plants to aid the government in times of national crisis, but it has now been clearly demonstrated that 80% of the industries of America could be concentrated on producing supplies necessary for modern warfare. It has been learned, for instance, that a dye factory may be transformed within a week or 10 days into a plant for the production of high explosives.
Come on.
The Committee on Industrial Preparedness, enlisting as it has the best scientific and commercial brains in the country, thoroughly understands all this and is guiding its labors thereby. So this was the stuff that was being written in the newspapers. And of course, this is right at the height of America's involvement in World War I. So it's, the more things change, the more things stay the same. People are always going to have, there's going to be extremes about what is or what's not going to happen.
Yeah.
The shades of gray are going to disappear. There have been other articles written in the local newspapers about the history of the dye mine. I found one that was written 51 years ago in 1971. Mm-hmm. And it makes men, at this time in 1971, there were still people that were living that had actual memories of the
dye mine.
Of the dye mine. Did you come across this
No,
article?
I didn't. Tell me about this.
Okay.
So this is from a 1971 article, and it's titled "Choctaw Bay Subsoil Makes Good Dye." Tell us what this says.
It does mention some of the people that worked here, that worked for the mine. It does mention some of the urban legends surrounding it. I'm just going to read from it. Even before the United States entered the war, the Allied blockade of Germany had halted the country's shipments of dye to the U.S. That had created a critical shortage since the country had depended on Germany and German-developed processes for its dyes prior to the war. Perhaps also it was used in the manufacture of explosives. Maybe the operators purposefully left the substance and its uses shrouded in a bit of mystery. And I think they kind of did, because here we are still talking about it 52 years later.
Well.
But they had the same questions. They didn't definitively say this was used for explosives. But so there was another article published in 1977. Again, this was from the Pensacola News Journal. They discussed the possibility of not just explosives being made, but U-boats, German U-boats, actually entering the bay. But they also mentioned that it was unsubstantiated. So this is clickbait, really. This is
1970s clickbait.
Absolutely.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, That's right.
So it begins with, it's a very good story and one that at least one self-proclaimed historian vows is true. But other more cautious souls say the story is based on fact and has been apparently embellished with suspicions and gossip born of imagination stimulated by a terrible and spreading war, and on natural conjecture. I think that about sums it up, doesn't it?
Pretty much. I think that's well put.
The next mention I can find of the dye mine was in 1916, and it was just being built. And it said, this is from the Pensacola News Journal. It says, new dye mine is prosperity sign.
Mm-hmm.
Industry recently established near Gagne's Bayou, making good and employing local labor. And yes, I said Gagne's Bayou and not Garnier's Bayou or but yeah, we'll get to that in a future podcast.
Okay, all right.
Bayou. And it is pronounced Gagne's Bayou. Among the many new industries which are putting West Florida on the commercial map may be mentioned the dye mine, recently opened at Black Point near Gagne's Bayou under the management of Professor James A. Wright.
Interesting.
W-R-I-G-H-T.
Interesting.
Interesting indeed. So, I know that I've read a lot of newspaper articles from over 100 years ago. This is probably the one that needs to be read the most because it really provides a perfect account of what the area looked like, what it felt like, what it sounded like. This is written 100 years ago by a Captain Patterson, who was a captain of a schooner that went up and down the Santa Rosa Sound from Pensacola to Choctaw Bay, making deliveries, to Freeport and the areas, Boggy Bayou, all around the area. So again, this is Captain Patterson. I myself, though a citizen since 1866, have towed thousands of pieces of timber and millions of feet of lumber down the Choctaw Bay. But never did I dream that there was so much wealth beneath the sandy soil of Black Point, 5 miles east of Camp Walton. I had never heard of it or seen it in print, and I doubt very much if there are 50 persons in the city who have ever heard anything about a dye plant operated on a small scale for more than a year at Black Point. There are several essential conditions to make anything successful, such as working a dye plant. First, there must be an abundance of material, and second, the conditions of the manufacture must be healthful. The public should know something about it. Information as to the possible good and as to the building and establishing a permanent enterprise that will be a blessing not alone to the immediate neighborhood where it is located, but to the portion of the state in which it is situated. Black Point, situated on Choctaw Bay, is a very beautiful place. The country is high and rolling, surrounded by pine forests and with a sandy loam soil. 6 miles across the bay is Santa Rosa Island, a narrow strip of land washed by the Gulf of Mexico. The atmosphere is pure, no swamps of malaria breeding stagnant water. The inhaling of the life-giving ozone coming with the pure air right from the Gulf is invigorating and strengthening. I am not writing from fancy, but from an experience of more than 2 months engaged in handling 4 large, lighter loads of about 280 tons of boilers, machinery, bricks, pipes, lumber, and other materials. The bay abounds in fish, and only a short distance away, oysters are to be found in abundance. The backwaters wash the beach clean and keep it free from anything contaminating. The promoters of this great enterprise deserve the praise and cooperation, not only of the citizens of the immediate vicinity, but of the entire state. The writer has been all over this globe of ours, has associated with men in all walks of life, and engaged in various businesses, but never has he had received more congenial, friendly, and gentlemanly treatment than since coming to the Black Point Dye Works. I take this method of expressing my appreciation of their kindness to me, and my prayer is that they may be blessed in this their great and laudable undertaking. Respectively, J.C. Patterson.
That's pretty neat. I appreciate you enlightening us, Gareth. It certainly gives some reason as to why the rumors started, and then gives some pretty good insight onto Black Point, an area people who have lived their entire lives in Shalimar have never even heard of, that there was a dye plant in Shalimar at one point. So, very cool stuff. I appreciate it, Gareth.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I can gather about Mr. Hausman is that he was a doctor, not sure of what, but I found articles well after World War I that showed he was part of a team working in the county to eradicate mosquitoes. This is possibly some of the first efforts as the county mosquito control department. He also published an article in 1921 naming the humate material he discovered after himself. In the paper, he called it Hasamite, and concluded in the paper the humic acid origin of asphalt and the belief that humate in Florida and elsewhere was the source material for petroleum. Now, an argument could be made that he published this in an effort to revive or create a business interest. Speaking of business, Shalimar was originally known as Port Dixie, The actual town of Shalimar is located mostly west of Eglin Parkway. The rest, minus the Shalimar Town Hall and Police Station, was known as Port Dixie. You'll notice how the streets are laid out in a grid pattern like bigger cities. This particular planning is probably the only visible evidence left of an enterprise from the 1920s and 30s of a huge development plan for the part of unincorporated Okaloosa County with the Shalimar zip code. Port Dixie was expected to be a world player in the shipping industry. Listen to this 1920s description from an article in the Pensacola Journal. Quote, "It is an industrial enterprise destined to be the second largest seaport in the United States. Port Dixie has the finest natural deepwater harbor on the entire Gulf of Mexico and the greatest tributary hinterland of any port in the world. Port Dixie is the closest commercial port in the United States to the Panama Canal and through it to the growing international trade with the Orient." That is quite a description. Back in the 1920s, $29 million was spent to acquire all the property. To think about that in 1920s terms, that's a lot of money, and equivalent today to $500 million. Imagine putting a $500 million investment into a venture in Shalimar today. Back then, investors included engineers, railroad developer, oil businessmen, tycoons of such. And the idea they were thinking was to dredge the East Pass so that large ships could get through, and then they would make their way to the port where a newly built railroad would deliver goods to the rest of the country. An excerpt from a news story said that M.C. Miller, who was a personal representative for the syndicate of investors of Port Dixie, said there would be, and it would be, quote, "ready-made town of the first importance with considerable more advantages and luxuries than most towns have today," end quote. And in the center of this handsome plaza, it said, a police department would be similar to Texas Ranger or the Northwest Mounted Police. Can you imagine that here in Shalimar? Can you imagine underground power lines? And at the end of the article, there was an ad for, this was interesting, malaria medicine. It said, "Take Oxidine for the chills and fever by removing their cause, which is malaria. People who take Oxidine feel well and are well." I hope I didn't give a free ad for Oxidine. I don't think it still exists. What a wild time to be living in, though. The drive and imagination that these investors seem to have had is impressive, but their vision, as you know, was not realized. Time went by and Port Dixie plans did not develop into a reality as of 1930, so over 10 years went by. But still, a 1931 article continued to build up the idea of a Port Dixie development despite lack of action. The media hype at that time was really something. But things slowed to a crawl. The Florida housing boom collapsed, then the Great Depression. Another thing worth noting is the inevitable realization that opening the East Pass to the size of ships that they wanted is not going to be a possibility. Shalimar was incorporated during the World War II era. Houses were constructed for Eglin officers and their families by Clifford Meigs. Meigs is a son-in-law of James Ellsworth Plew, who was a mover and shaker of the times, who moved here from Chicago, and he's considered the founder of the town of Valparaiso. Plew had success with a towel rental business for hospitals that became huge in the Midwest. He developed the Plew bicycle seat, was an early used car dealer, and an avid airplane enthusiast. In fact, he was one of the first passengers on the Wright brothers airplane. He owned the first airplane in Chicago before 1910. A movie could probably be made about Mr. Plew. But I'm sorry, let me keep things moving. What about the name Shalimar? According to newspaper accounts, the name Shalimar was suggested by Plew's daughter. She likely got the idea from the popularity of the word Shalimar in pop culture. Shalimar has its roots as the name of a garden and, in one song, a river located in India and in the Pakistan area. In 1925, the name Shalimar was added to a perfume by a perfume maker named Goran out of France. It made its way to the West and became enormously popular, and it's still around today. The perfume reviewer on YouTube that I saw recently called it elegant but a little naughty since flappers wore this scent back in the day. The scent itself is said to start off with hints of citrus, then moves to a cedar, leather, sandalwood aroma. The name Shalimar was chosen by the perfume maker probably due to a poem written by a person named Lawrence Pope. The poem was titled Kashmiri Song and is kind of a love story. Here's a little excerpt. Pale hands I've loved beside the Shalimar, where are you now, where are you now? Pale hands pink-tipped, like lotus buds that float on those cool waters where we used to dwell. I would have rather felt you round my throat, crushing out life than waving me farewell. Perfume reviewers call this the ultimate oriental scent. And speaking of oriental, there was in fact an ad I found in the newspapers from the 1940s selling a Shalimar-style rug. I even found the name of a sailing vessel named Shalimar in the 1940s that was active in numerous sailing regattas in South Florida. Either way, the name Shalimar was known, and it was a popular term and known mostly for elegance. So why not a good name for a new and up-and-coming town, right? This town, of course, that would become the place to be if you were anybody. A place to socialize with celebrities and politicians. A place to dance and listen to music, and perhaps a place to enjoy some adult beverages while throwing some dice between dances with your significant other. Since the 75th anniversary celebration was recently held, I reached out to the current Shalimar mayor, Mark Franks. He met me at the Magnolia Grill in downtown Fort Walton Beach, where we sat down with restaurant owner and longtime Northwest Florida historian and volunteer, Tom Rice. Here's Tom discussing what the area looked like before there were homes and roads, and also how the nightlife from the big-named establishment, the Shalimar Club, helped the incorporation of the town.
So the area was growing. The highways weren't in yet, but there was a lot of land up where we call Shalimar, Port Dixie, acres and acres of land, and they had the idea to grow grapes. They considered all this farmland. In between the bridges in Fort Walton, between the Cinco Bridge and the Shalimar Bridge, Dr. Beale, Peg's great-grandfather, he looked at that as farms, and they could probably plant berries there, blackberries, to make wine or for produce. But in Shalimar, James Plew, he was from Chicago. He owned 9,000 acres around the Valparaiso Inn. But he also came down here, and where the fire station is next to the county building, there was a red brick building built out of clay tiles, and that was the Shalimar Winery.
But also, we didn't bring up, I guess in the 20s there was also a Shalimar Lodge.
This is Mayor Mark Franks.
And that was really, and later a winery. But people they fish, hunt, swam, and relaxed in a rustic lodge covered with wisteria.
And here's Tom Rice again.
Plew built golf course, and one of the toughest, people from Chicago coming down playing golf.
I've heard Al Capone. Was that a true?
Oh,
I had to bring it up.
Yeah,
I'm
thanks,
sorry.
man. Come on. Oh, yeah, come on, Tom. What about Al Capone?
No, that it's a fun story, but he was he was watched a lot. They kept track of him, and trains took him to Miami from Chicago, and that's how he traveled, and nobody in the family, and we've got an extensive foundation from Dr. Beale's time, who was here in the 1905s, 1910s, never had any inkling. There were probably shady folks that came in or somebody different, but that would be like you stopping in a small town in Mississippi to get gas. They'd be looking at you with your long hair and saying, I don't know, boy, what are you doing here? So I don't know. I don't think so. Nobody's got a picture of him.
I don't know that. So that's the reason I know so much about Plew, is because that's the Chicago connection. So I started researching Chicago newspapers, and I couldn't find anything that sounded anything like organized crime or any names connected to him.
The town of Fort Walton had different schedule of blue laws, what time you could open, what time you could close.
Here's Tom again talking about how the Shalimar Club helped the incorporation of the town.
And so out in the county, Roger Clary had built in 1947, had built the Shalimar Club on Eglin Field Highway, this road, this 2-lane road that went up to the entrance to Eglin Air Force Base and then on its way to Niceville and up to Crestview. And this was going to be a problem. Here's a guy he spent a considerable amount of money on this beautiful red brick, red tile, high-ceilinged ballroom, bar, and they were going to be shut down. While downtown in Fort Walton, the Magnolia Club would have continued to be in business. So that was, the Megs, they got their heads together and said, if we incorporated and made a town, then we can make the rules. There's a lot of focus that people do about the gambling. And, the gambling was secondary to the operation of the dance floor, the military here, the dancing, the big bands, the bar. The gambling was not just at the Magnolia Club and at the Shalimar Club, but gambling went on all over the community.
Yeah, everywhere.
Newspaper
accounts call them gambling dens. And
what's hilarious to me, and we talked about it at the anniversary celebration, we kind of touched on it, was that, we're against casino gambling in Florida, except for on the Indian reservations. We don't want any gambling. We shut these things down. And who is the biggest casino in the state of Florida? It turns out the state of Florida is the biggest casino in the state of Florida. Scratch-offs, lotto, all these things that, in those days, down in the drugstore down on Main Street in Fort Walton, there were slot machines. Mm-hmm. Nickel and dime and quarter. Quarter was probably that was the highest one. I mean, that was putting a lot of money in it. But the gambling, when Roger Clary built the Shalimar Club, and we've got some photos of it, the main building where the ballroom was, that we used for school dances in later years in high school in Choctaw, and when OW came, the scholarship ball that were held, things that were held there. The casino was a separate building that was added later. Now, when the gambling did shut down, the call came that Little Vegas had to go away. That was kind of all over the state of Florida. The governor, sheriffs, you got to do your job. There is no gambling. Mm-hmm. So when the gambling stopped, the Magnolia Club soon closed. The Shalimar Club closed. Luckily, for people in Shalimar, the Shalimar Club, while it was closed, Roger Clary kept the license. There was always a license taped to the mirror behind the bar. So when they had the Billy Bowlegs yearly, the yearly coronation ball, the Christmas ball, those kind of events that were held there, and this was a beautiful ballroom, huge thing. Harry Truman came, was had one of their banquets there, and Jimmy Doolittle is pictured. A lot of the pictures that were taken by Arturo for the Playground News, before it was the Northwest Florida Daily News. So a lot of those pictures, have become what went on there.
The Shalimar Club had all kinds of acts and was a meeting place for local organizations too. I found ads in the newspapers in the 40s that mentioned a hilarious hat parade of 1949 at the Shalimar Club, held by the Eglin officers' wives. And one of the interesting acts advertised was Bubbles Becker and his orchestra, only person to blow smoke bubbles, according to Ripley's Believe It or Not. Bubbles Becker was featured at the Shalimar Club. Here's Tom again.
Luckily for the community, the building it was well built. Roger Clary was a builder. He built solid.
That's interesting that you said that, because during Hurricane Eloise, I found an account of people that decided to
hunker down. There was about 15-20 people that stayed there during Eloise, and no damage was the report. Nothing, who were some of the other celebrities? Because there wasn't just Truman, wasn't just Jimmy Doolittle. I thought Gregory Peck.
Gregory Peck. I'm sorry. But also, I was going to ask you, Tom, I've heard Andy Griffith, Andy Griffith, did stand-up comedy when he first started.
Sure.
I've been trying to come across a photograph, but no luck as of yet. So
that's really cool.
Anybody's out there that knows of one, please let us know.
And so for folks listening, Andy Griffith's show was a popular show. It was in black and white for and you could still see it if you wake up in the morning on Sundance Channel 301 at Cox Cable.
And Little Opie,
it's
had hair,
and it's a good show. It still is. I'll find myself watching it. So that's really interesting.
And in the files, and there were so many pictures taken at so many events, and this is one of the pictures that. Was dropped to me. And there's Jerry Melvin. Jerry Melvin sitting there. Governor Leroy Collins. The place was a very classy operation. They're all in white dinner jackets. In this particular image, they're all in white dinner jackets with black ties. And this is a picture. The folks listening can't see, but. A very shy, off to the side Roger Clary with his white dinner jacket and his bow tie standing in the lounge of the Shalimar Club with Miss Ella. And they lived right next door. They built their home after the Shalimar Club was built and running. They built their home right next door. And so when you come down from Eglin, the hotel that's there on Meigs Drive and Eglin Boulevard now, you'll see the hotel, and that's where Ella and Roger's home was until they moved to Destin in later years.
Mayor Franks again.
Some people don't realize that where Cheers is today.
Right.
That's part of the building.
Part of the back.
That Shalimar Club was at, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So,
what we remember when we were kids.
And here's Tom Rice again.
Was going to Choctawhatchee High School. It was built in 1953, opened in 1953. The first class went from the K through 12 school here downtown Fort Walton. There was a compromise made to not move the high school to Niceville or Valpy, but to have it somewhere in between. So there were Long Needle Pines, where Meigs Drive is now, where Meigs Middle School is today. They built the Choctawhatchee High School, and it opened, and paint was still smelling fresh in 1953. But there was, quite a few families that had settled here from Armenia. There were Armenians, and the Guderian family had the Bally High Motel. There were several hotels that dealt with military folks. Eglin was huge during World War II, and that's what a lot of the growth of the area were. People getting sand in their shoes and coming back here and opening up businesses. My father-in-law, Starkey Motel, 1953, 54, built that. Roger Clary comes out of World War II, builds a Shalimar Club, partners with his brother-in-law to run the sawmill. When we go up to Niceville to the Mullet Festival grounds, Roger owned the sawmill. And when we were kids, you wouldn't go.
Who was his son-in-law, real quick?
It was his brother-in-law. It was Miss Ella's brother, and he was in the lumber business. So Mr. Clary was as much in the bar business as he was in the lumber business. He loved wood. If you look at the Shalimar Club today, when you go by, we've been just so lucky that building has not been demolished. It's well built. It's huge. It's now it's rented by the owners to Georgia Tech, and by it being utilized, it's been saved. Roger Clary also built Silver Beach Cottages, which was on the other side of Destin, where the Silver Beach Towers are today, almost in line with the Destin Airport. And to make a reservation there weren't any telephone lines yet to that part of Destin when the Shalimar Club was in operation. So you made your reservation for the Silver Beach Cottages at the same number. Roger Clary, manager and owner of both places.
How about that? It's hard for me to look at Shalimar the same way after learning so much about its history. The future, I think, of the town and surrounding Port Dixie is headed in the right direction. Mayor Franks is certainly optimistic and a good sport, especially when it comes to people outside of his town calling him mayor and asking him to help them out. Here's Mayor Franks.
Interesting enough, when I was a kid, I would go and we had tennis lessons out there at Shalimar Point. And I remember even as a kid thinking, man, I love this place. There was just something about Shalimar. And so when my wife and I moved here, I wanted to, as mayor, I just want, what can we do to make it even better? What I did when I decided to be mayor is I just went to every business that I could and talked to them and asked them what they liked about it. And a lot of it's the history, I'm not going to say Shalimar is this great growing, metro, but it's a small town. And when you mentioned Mayberry, I feel like it is a type of Mayberry.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really want to do as mayor is get us together more, which is what we do. And the 75th, people loved it. They absolutely loved it. And just watching the kids and our future, they're out there playing. I just think that's the magic of a community, getting together and enjoying each other. So, but we have a lot of thriving businesses in this town. Like you said, it's a clean town, good community, neighbors helping each other. So it's a good place to live. I can't tell you how many people think that I'm still their mayor. I'm like, look, you're, technically you're not, but they don't even care. They're like, well, you're our mayor. So I don't really get into that very much. If they're in Shalimar, or if there's something I can be a part of, especially with the kids, I'm there. I don't get too hung up on that. So it's a community, in my opinion. So.
This episode was written and produced by me. The executive producer is April Sarver. She is the public information officer for Okaloosa County. The theme music for Flashback is composed by Jason Shaw on Audionautics.com. Special thanks to Kay Saxon Brooks, Gareth Stearns, Tom Rice, and Mayor Mark Franks. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you around town.